I'm trying to map things out for the next section of Matthew here. We may take a Wednesday night and just have some end times discussions, because there's going to be a lot of stuff in Matthew 24 that I'm not going to be able to or wanting to take on in that context. My personal preference, I like to talk end time stuff where we can dialogue more than just me preach it at you. So when I'm preaching, I'm going to stick to the main stuff that is really obvious and right there, and not necessarily a matter of lots and lots of extra interpretation. And maybe we'll do something here to try and complement that. We'll see how things come together. But for tonight, we are still in 2 Kings. And if you would go ahead and get to chapter 13. We already looked at chapter 13, but that's where I want to start. I want to just ask this question. Who is God gracious to? To whom is God gracious? Everyone? Right? Well, there's a real sense he is gracious to everyone, right? I mean, the fact that anybody's breathing is God's grace. What's that? Anybody he wants to. Yeah, one of the things that comes up in this section of Scripture is that God is gracious to people that you and I may not always be able to appreciate. Why is he being gracious to them? So we kind of blew past this last week. In chapter 13, we read about Jehoash, and he is a king in... he's a king in chapter 13, in the 23rd year of Joash, the son, and this is why it gets confusing, the son of Ahaziah, king of Judah. Jehoash, so we got Joash and we have Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, became king over Israel. So we're in Israel, we're looking at Jehoahaz, and he is there for 17 years. And what kind of king was he? Look at verse 2. He was Milo. He was a bad guy. He is not nice. And while we're throwing other language out there, fun Hebrew word, the boys are learning this, it's ra. If something's bad, it's ra. Okay, so he was ra. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And he followed the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. So that's going way back to the beginning of the history of Israel. And verse 3, God responds. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. That's what we expect. And he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, the king of Aram, Syria, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the next generation. Okay, that makes sense, right? You're bad, God sends you punishment. Sure, everybody agrees with that. But then Jehoahaz entreated the favor of the Lord. And the Lord listened to him. And he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Aram oppressed them. And the Lord gave them a deliverer. Two themes that we're going to pick up on that are going to continue into the chapters that are new for us tonight are these. One, God is gracious to the people he wants to be gracious to, right? Whoever he wants to be gracious to, he can be gracious to them. And he's gracious to people that surprise us. He also allows bad things to happen to people that otherwise seem like pretty good guys. And so we need to be careful how we, especially when we look in from the outside, how we interpret what's going on there. Is God approving of someone or disapproving of them based on their life circumstances? That's a dangerous equation to try and calculate. The other thing that I want you to see that's going to get repeated is God is always at work. He's always at work, right? So it was God whose wrath was kindled against Israel, and he's the one who gives them into the hands of Hazael. And we did talk about that last week. There's this part of us that initially reads that, and we're frustrated because we're going, wait, God is giving these people over, and he's in control of this, and I don't really like that. God's in control of things that seem bad here. And yet, there's something comforting too, because nothing's happening that's outside of God's control. Even as he disciplines his people, he's not lost control at all. And we mentioned Isaiah chapter 10, where God speaks about Assyria, and he says, I'm going to use them to judge my people, and then I'm going to judge them for how bad they were when they judged my people. And so God's in control of that. And God is also the one who says, okay, I'm going to send a deliverer to my people. So God and his overarching control of the things that are happening is really prominent in these stories. These stories do not try to answer all the theological questions that brings up in your mind, right? And so, because we tend to, and maybe it's just me, but I think I'm not the only one, who tends to go, sovereignty of God and the free will of people, and I go back to, freshman year of Bible college coffee house debates, how are we going to settle this? And I have to keep reminding myself that sometimes the Bible doesn't tell us how to settle everything. And our questions are not the questions we're supposed to be asking. This story is being told to encourage God's people that even as God judged his people, even as they ultimately go into exile, he has not lost control and he has not given up on what he's doing. And how that all relates to free will is just not even on the table here. It's just not the point. The Bible doesn't have to explain everything to us. God doesn't have to explain everything to us. Sometimes we just get this, and we want to extrapolate more from that. And there's a place for trying to do that. We can do that in coherent ways. But we need to be careful not to miss the real thing that God is actually communicating. So we're going to see that come up a couple of times. Now, let's jump forward. Chapter 13, just to a quick review. We saw the death of Elisha, and Elisha, when he dies, they bury him, and then a man is thrown into his grave, and that man lives. And there's something there, just a reminder of God's faithfulness and God's ability to work even beyond the grave. That's what we looked at. Now we get to chapter 14. And we read about Amaziah, king over Judah. Now, what kind of king is he? Look down at verse 3. He did pretty good, right? I mean, so verse 3, really, that looks really good. He did right in the sight of the Lord, but not yet like David his father. He did according to all that Joash his father had done. So okay, there's some good things there. It's not great, but it's not terrible compared to Israel. What's that? Yeah. So, but then the high places, right? The high places are not taken away. People are still sacrificing there. But it came about, verse 5, as soon as the kingdom was firmly in his hand, that he killed the servants who had slain the king, his father, and the sons of the slayers he did not put to death. This is good, according to what was written in the law of Moses. So he says, hey, there's some interest in what the law says. That's a good start. It's okay. It's fun to have a little soundtrack in the background. There's some good things here. When you read the rest of chapter 14, one of the things you realize is that it doesn't go that great for him. He gets in a battle with Israel and he loses. Wait a minute, but Israel's really bad. And he's not that bad. And yet God doesn't have him win. Again, God is gracious to who he wants to be gracious to. Then we read, jumping down to the next part, starting in verse 17, we read the story of the next king in Israel, and we read about Jeroboam, and he's a bad king. If you look down at verses 23 and 24, in the 5th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, the king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel. That's also confusing. There's Joashes in Israel and in Judah. He became the king of Samaria. And he reigned for 41 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. So is he a good guy? Not really. Not anything nice to say here. He did rule a long time, and during his time, God was actually good to Israel, right? So Jonah was a prophet during this time. You can read about him in verse 25. And the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, that it was very bitter, for there was neither bond nor free, nor was there any helper in Israel. And the Lord did not say that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. So we have one guy who was like pretty good, and God does not give him victory in battle. And we have another guy who's decidedly bad, and God does work with him. How do you feel about that?
I don't know, he's God.
Okay, yeah, good answer, right? Above my pay grade. That is a very good answer. But there is a part of us, at least for some of us, that we get a little bothered by that, right? We go, that's not, I don't like that. God shouldn't do that. But God is working above our pay grade. Who knows what other things he knows that we don't know, that aren't in these stories? Who knows what he's doing? He's not doing this for Jeroboam. He's not saying, Jeroboam, you're really, I'm just going to let you off the hook. I really do like you a lot. He's hearing his people. So it's more than just the king that is at play. I think that's actually a really important thing for us to keep in mind in our own life. You understand that it's not just about you? I don't know if anybody's told you, it's not just about you. There's more going on. And so sometimes, what's that?
Shouldn't we rejoice when our brothers are getting blessed?
We should. We should absolutely rejoice. And sometimes we get pulled into blessing that we don't deserve. In fact, if we're Christians, we understand that the greatest blessings that we enjoy have absolutely nothing to do with us and have everything to do with grace and God just choosing to be gracious to us through his Son. And then there are times when the wicked do prosper. This is something that comes up in the Psalms, right? And it is upsetting. It's upsetting to David. David asks, "Why do the wicked prosper?" I don't like that. And this is one of those times we need to let God be God. So we can go back to Ed's answer and just go, okay, above my pay grade, God is at work. But again, this is going to continue, and this is also helping Israel to understand and Judah to understand God's plan is bigger than any one individual. His plans are for his people as a whole. So the next thing that we're going to notice is Uzziah, also Azariah. He was probably called Uzziah instead of Azariah because when we read a little bit more full account of his life in the book of 2 Chronicles, there was also Azariah the high priest at the same time. And so that's super confusing. So a lot of people became accustomed to calling him Uzziah instead, right? You know that when you were in class as a kid and there were like 3 people and they were all named Joe and you had to come up with different names because it just didn't work. We have multiple Jim Johnsons in our church, and so we had to find ways to distinguish who we're talking about. Same kind of thing is happening here. So sometimes he's Azariah, sometimes he's Uzziah. Most of the time in 2 Kings, he is Azariah, and the reason for that is because we don't get any details about the high priest in this story. His story, as it's presented here, paints him in a really pretty good light, right? If you look at verse 3, what do we learn about him? Oh, sorry. Sorry, that's right. 15:3. Thank you. Yeah, he did what was right. Yeah, so he did what was right according to all his father Uzziah had done. So he kept doing the good things that his dad was doing. And yet, he did leave the high places. And then we just read this kind of abruptly in verse 5. The Lord struck the king so that he was a leper to the day of his death. He was a good guy, And God made him a leper. And you're like, what? Now, right, I mean, okay, so maybe it's the high places. There is actually more to this story. One of the things I think we should try to learn to do, though, is to remember that God gave us the history of his people in this book, right? And each author, inspired by God, has unique points that they are trying to make. And so the Gospels all tell us historically true things about Jesus Christ and what he did and how he lived. And yet they don't all tell the same stories, and even when they do tell the same stories, they have slightly different focus. And sometimes we're really quick to want to just harmonize everything, and that there's a place for that. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but when we do that, we can miss the unique points that a particular author is trying to bring out. So here, I think you are supposed to read this and be a little jarred and go like, wait a minute, he was good, but then God made him a leper, because again, this fits with the theme that we're discussing. It also fits with the theme that we're discussing in the sense that there's more than you know about what's going on. Because if you read the story in 2 Chronicles, he intends to go into the temple and to do things that only the priests are supposed to do. And the priests confront him, and he yells at him, and when he yells at him, he becomes a leper. And so, God did have a good reason for doing that. But if you just had 2 Kings, you wouldn't know that. You know that's true of a lot of things that you look at in life, and you go, why did God do that? That doesn't seem fair. All based on my perspective and my information, that's not right. And God's just probably going, yeah, but I have a different perspective than you do. And someday, there will be no question in your mind that everything that God has done, everything that he has allowed, has been just and for purposes that serve justice. It's hard to see that right now. And I think this is a neat story that just shows us that. It says, well, you know what? There's actually more behind this. And this is an instance where God does allow us to see that through another inspired author who wrote more stories, more about this story. So 2 Chronicles 26, 16 to 21, in case you're interested. By the way, because of the way we're going to study the Old Testament, we won't get to Chronicles for a long time. So if you're really interested in comparing the accounts, you may want to do that sooner than later, because it'll be a while before we come back to these stories. At any rate, he does become a leper. He has to reign vicariously through his son, and he goes off and lives separated from the people for a time. Then we get Zechariah over Israel, and basically a series of kings. They're all bad. Everything about it is not good. Zechariah, verse 9, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done, just continuing the tradition. He was allowed to be king because God had made a promise. God is faithful to his promises. Verse 12, the Lord had made a promise to Jehu, saying, your sons to the fourth generation shall sit on the throne. This is the fourth generation. We are now going to be switching out. There's going to be other families ruling. So we're going to have Shalom reigning, and then we have Menahem, and he is going to reign. Menahem is not a nice guy. Verse 18, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the ways of the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. So this sin has been, even though it's not been passed down in a family line, these people just keep on repeating these patterns of sin from the kings before them. There's a guy named Pul, and he's the king of Assyria, and he comes against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver so that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom under his rule. And so basically what Menahem is saying is, hey, I'm just going to pay this guy off, right? You can't beat him, join him, give him a bunch of money. Let's see if we can make this go away. And so he ends up charging the people lots of money. What would have been a better option? What would have been a better option? Ask God for help, right? Turn to the Lord. Another big theme that runs through this book is God is gracious to the people who turn to him. We just saw that with Jehoahaz, who was a bad guy, but when he cried out to God, God was gracious. And unfortunately, that's not what we see here. And we saw that with Jehoshaphat. Remember Jehoshaphat? He pairs up with the king of Israel, and they are going to fight the invading armies. And they don't seek God out, and they run around in a circle for an entire week. And then Jehoshaphat's like, wait a minute, we should seek God. And then God gives them this miraculous victory. Water comes from we don't know where. Of course, we know it comes from God. But and they have this amazing victory. Even God's people, as they are entrenched in sin, if they would just turn to him and cry out to him, he would be responsive. That theme is going to get picked up in a big way in the life of Hezekiah. Hezekiah has two big stories about prayer and turning to God in the midst of problems. Well, then we get Pekahiah. He's over Israel. He's not good. Verse 24, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Keeps all of these bad things going. We read about Jotham over Judah. So this is Uzziah's son. And he is, he does pretty good, right? He, in verse 34, did what was right in the sight of the Lord, did according to all that his father, now we've switched to Uzziah here, all that his father Uzziah had done, but the high places are still there. And so again, we get these little glimpses of hope, like maybe this is the guy, maybe this is the guy. He's particularly interesting in verse 33. His mother gets mentioned. Usually mom doesn't get mentioned. But here she's mentioned, and she's the daughter of Zadok. And there's discussion about who that might be, because of course there could be multiple people with Zadok. But Zadok was the priest. He was the high priest during the time of David. And his name, usually when you see Zadok mentioned, it has something to do with that priestly line. And so this is like, hey, he's like the king priest that we've been waiting for a long time, maybe. Except he's not. And even as he does good, look what happens in verse 37. In those days, the Lord began to send Rezin, the king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, against Judah. So here's these guys, and they're comparatively better than the kings of Israel, and yet God is still putting pressure on them through the nations. What does that tell us about God allowing bad things to happen? God disciplines his own. Okay. So, and is there a difference between discipline and punishment?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what is the difference?
Discipline corrects and brings you closer to God.
Okay. Yeah. So discipline is not merely punitive, where punishment at least can be merely punitive. God is still allowing bad things to happen to those who are comparatively righteous. What do you think God, this is speculative, I know this is not in the text, but what do you think God would want for his people to do as he's sending these foreign armies against them? Turn to him. Repent, turn, yeah. Say, hey, we're gonna get rid of the high places and to see them grow and to see them flourish. You hear Jesus talking about, and of course there are different ways to understand this, but Jesus talking about how many times I wanted to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks. And some people see that as Jesus just saying, throughout my ministry I've wanted to do this. Could be that. But a lot of commentators say, let's zoom out, and you can actually hear Jesus, the divine voice, God's voice in the incarnate Son, saying, I've been wanting to save you guys for so long. And all of these times that I've sent prophets to you, and I think we could even say, and when I've sent persecution to you, I've been trying to get you to turn, but you haven't wanted to. And so, sadly, we see that Judah starts to spiral downward with Ahaz when he becomes the king. He is not a good king. We read in verse 2, he was there for 16 years, and towards the end, chapter 16, verse 2, he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, and what his father had done, but he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and made his son pass through fire, which seems like we think is a euphemistic way to say he sacrificed his son. He killed his son. So remember when we were in the Torah, those first 5 books, and in Leviticus and Deuteronomy in particular, God said in multiple places, don't be like the nations that I'm driving out before you. Don't give your children to Molech and those statues with their arms out, and there would be fires lit underneath them. It would put your child in the smoldering arms of these idols and sacrifice them. This is how bad things have gotten. Now, what happens is Ahaz finds himself in political trouble, and so he reaches out to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and he says, "Hey, I'm your servant and your son." The king of Judah, of the line of David, whose son is he supposed to be? David's son. And God says, what the one we're waiting for is also going to be his son. God says he'll be like a son to me. He's supposed to serve God. He's supposed to be a son to God. And yet here he is going to a pagan king, and he's saying, I'm your servant, I'm your son. Now come help me out, basically. And what Ahaz does in verse 8, so it's Assyria versus Syria, or Assyria versus Aram, depending on what your translation is doing with those names. And he took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, and he sent a present to the king of Assyria. So he just took God's stuff and he just gave it to this pagan king. And he's doing the same thing that we saw last week, treating a pagan king like God, giving him the things that belong to God. Now, last week, it was on account of fear that we noticed this, right? And this week, it's a little bit different. And I told you last week, what you fear functionally becomes God for you, right? What you're afraid of functionally becomes God, and you will act like it. You'll worship that God. And so we saw another king giving all the stuff to a pagan king, all of God's stuff to a pagan king. But I also say this: whatever you think will save you, whatever you think will fix your life, that will oftentimes functionally become a God for you too, right? So if you think that your life will be fixed by money, guess what? That will functionally become your God. If you think that your life will be fixed by being healthy, right? So nothing wrong with money, nothing wrong with being healthy. But if you think that's going to fix all my problems, you ever met people who are like obsessed with dieting and going to the gym? It functionally becomes their God. They will do anything and everything to have that. If you think being popular will fix your problems, that will functionally become your God. Popularity will become your God. That will be what you serve and what you live for. If you think that climbing the ladder at work, whatever it is, right? All of those things that you think will make your life better and that will fix all of your problems, that will functionally become your God. And so what's happened here is Ahaz is afraid of one thing, but he says, okay, I'm not going to bow in fear. I'm going to run to somebody who can save me. And he treats this pagan king like God, because Tiglath-Pileser, for him, is functionally God, because Tiglath-Pileser is who's going to save him. And that's why he's willing to give him the things that only should belong to God. He ties his identity to him, and he gives these treasures from the temple to him. He goes so far, he goes to Damascus to meet with Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and basically he sees the way that they worship, and he says, that's pretty cool. We should do that too. And so he replaces the bronze altar that God had given instructions from heaven to Moses to make, and he makes his own altar, which is called the Great Altar. And he says, look, we're going to offer the major sacrifices over there. I'll still keep the bronze altar. His plan for the bronze altar in verse 15 is for me to inquire by. He's going to inquire by that, which seems to, again, most scholars agree, that seems to be technical language for he is going to practice divination there. He's going to do the very things he's not supposed to do. So in the ancient cultures, they would take the entrails of certain animals, and they thought that by their feel and whatever, and of course certain incantations and all that stuff, that they could figure out the future. He has completely abandoned the true God. Now, the king Ahaz cut off the borders of the stands. He removes the laver. So he does all of these things, and he's doing terrible. His life comes to an end, and we get to Hezekiah in chapter 17. Sorry, we don't get to Hezekiah in chapter 17. We get to Hezekiah in chapter 18. He's the next king. But we're dealing with Hoshea over Israel here. Hoshea, he is not a great guy. He goes to Shalmaneser, who's now the king of Assyria. And basically, Shalmaneser, he finds out that Hoshea is playing games and isn't being straight with him. And so he comes and he takes over. The king of Assyria, verse 4, found conspiracy in Hoshea, who had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. So the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. And this is the end. This is the end of Israel. Their story is wrapping up here in so many ways. Now, it's not wrapping up completely because God still has a plan, but this line of kings and this period in the kingdom history is coming to a close. And what we get is a summary of all the reasons why this happened. So again, this idea of sovereignty, really important, that Israel didn't lose because they were smaller or because they were weaker. They lost because they abandoned God. Because your connection to God is the deciding factor through all of these stories. So they feared other gods. They walked in the customs of the nations. They built high places. They built sacred pillars and Asherim on the high hills. They burned incense in the high places. Verse 11, they did this as the nations did, which the Lord carried away to exile before them, and they did evil things, provoking the Lord. They became the very people who God was righteously judging through them when they came into the land. And so they served idols, concerning which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this thing. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways, keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded to your fathers, which I sent through my servants, the prophets. God is saying, I've been trying to get your attention. But they wouldn't listen. That's verse 14. So they were stiff-necked like their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God. The foundational problem is that they refuse to believe in God. They refuse to trust him. And so they end up trusting all of these other things, all of these other people, and it will not work. That imagery of stiff-neckedness is an image that, if you're familiar with animals, you can probably relate to that. It's really a livestock imagery when the animal doesn't want to do what you want it to do, and they just stiffen up on you, and they won't turn their head, they won't cooperate. I have a ram who's doing much better now. Something happened to his hoof, but man, stubborn little ram. Trying to grab a hold of him and trying to get him to turn the way I wanted him to turn, and try doing that with like a bull or something. That's the idea. It's just really stubborn. Won't do what's best for you. And I tried to tell the ram. I said, hey, I'm trying to help you. He didn't care. And of course, we get that with livestock. But God is saying, you're acting like livestock. You're acting like animals. You should be able to hear me. I've been talking to you. So all of this, listen to verse 15. They rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he made with their fathers, and his warnings with which he warned them. And they followed vanity, becoming vain. And they went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which the Lord had commanded them not to do like them. Remember when we read Psalm 115 together? It's a rebuke of those who would worship idols that are fashioned with hands, and they have eyes but can't see, and they have ears but can't hear. And then verse 8 says, and those who worship them become like them. That's exactly what's happened. They follow vanity, and they've become vain. They follow emptiness, and they have become empty. So God sends them into exile. Verse 18 is important. The Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. So on the one hand, at the beginning of this, we read that this is really about Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, and he's the one doing it. But at the end we go, actually this is God. God is at work in all of this, and this is all according to his plan. Things only get worse. Assyria's strategy in their program was a little bit different than Babylon. Assyria took some people out and led them away captive, and then intentionally moved other people in. And the Assyrian, this was an intentional method employed by the Assyrians so that people would lose their identity. And so what you do is you mix people around so that they have to integrate and assimilate to whatever new society they're in. And this is how they would make the next generation their subjects, because they would lose their identity. And this is where you get Samaria and in the New Testament, and they're kind of this hybrid between Jewish and pagan rituals. Well, it's because of intentionally moving in pagans and mixing them with Jewish beliefs so that everybody loses their identity, and then they identify with Assyria. They were brutal. You can see some of their artistry, the way that they would impale people on poles for punishment. They would fillet people alive. When they carried you away, they wouldn't shackle your ankles together. They stuck hooks up through your jaw and out your mouth and tied you together. They're not nice people.
They have murals on their walls
That depict all of that. Yeah.
just like, whoa.
Yeah. If you ever get to see some of the exhibits from Assyria, they're very proud of this, and it's all over their I forget what the right word is for their wall carvings, murals, basically, the reliefs. Yeah. And it's pretty nasty stuff. Not nice folks. Okay. But this is happening, and God has not lost control in this. This is happening, and God has been trying to prevent this for these people, and yet they have resisted all the way along. This brings out one of the points that I was trying to make on Sunday, which is that somehow we need to be able to account for the fact that God is sovereign and he's in control, and yet when people reject him, it is their responsibility. That's the whole point of this passage. Like we've been seeing, God's in control, God's in control, God's in control. And yet at the same time, the Bible is very clear. People are responsible for their actions. And God is just in what he allows to happen. Things only get worse. They move these new people in, and things are just falling back into the way they were in the land from the beginning. Okay, I thought we might get to Hezekiah. I was so excited. Hezekiah, great story. If you've not read anything with us so far, you want to at least read chapters 18 through 20, because we won't do verse by verse of that. It's easy reading. The stories of Hezekiah's life are they read easy. I'm very willing to say some parts of the Bible don't read easy. These ones are pretty easy reading. Very encouraging to see God responding to prayer. That we get this glimmer of hope in Hezekiah. That there's a lot of beauty there. Well, we'll go ahead and leave it. Again, all of these stories, they're pointing us to Christ. They're pointing us to the need for Christ. We need this king. We need this king who is going to be righteous. And so far, even the best guys, it's like, yeah, they're pretty good, but they still failed in this way. What I'm hoping is that next week we will get not only to Hezekiah, but also I'm going to shoot for finishing 2 Kings. Okay, so we're going to see Hezekiah, we're going to see Josiah, these bright blips on the map, little moments of glory, and yet still, because you already know this, it's not enough. And there's a deeper change that God's people need still. Okay, we'll go ahead and leave it there. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for your graciousness to us. You are fair and you are just and you are in control. Help us to find comfort in that. Help us to look to you as the greatest and the strongest, as the most glorious being, to not esteem anything as greater than you by way of fear or by way of hope. Lord, help us not to fall into idolatry, but to trust you, to believe in you. This is what you have always been asking of your people. We ask that you would give us grace to trust you more. We ask that your Spirit would work in our hearts and in our lives that we might trust you as we should. We thank you that the true King, the good King, the righteous and perfect King has come and is coming again. It's in his name that we come before you and ask these things. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Thank you guys.